creationism has evolved as well. Modern creationism of the 21st century stripes is kind of okay with plate tectonics. They didn't start out that way. They were absolutely certain that continental drift was complete crock. And they eventually had to adopt it in the same way that you hear stuff about pseudogenes and all of this, as if they were paying attention to this.
Now I noticed he talked about CPT, and if anyone doesn't know about that, that's catastrophic plate tectonics. That certainly makes testable, falsifiable predictions. Just one example of the evidence for that. I mean, if you look at the Indian plate that pushes up to Eurasia, that pushed up the huge Tibetan plateau is really evidence of the CPT model that happened during the global flood. And at the end of the day, slow and gradual evolution could not accomplish that. It had to have been an awful strong force that created this plateau with Mount Everest. So I don't know how the evolutionists would explain that, plus all the other evidence for CPT.
I'm glad he brought up catastrophic plate tectonics, because boy, that's something that doesn't work. It's preposterously wrong. And bringing up the Indian plate is a particularly delicious example, because we can trace the plate movement. We can measure the plate movement, for one thing. You can physically measure the amounts that things are uplifting. We can measure the distance at which the plate is moving. And there's nothing in this that is inconsistent with the actual dynamics of geological processes. We know that 70 million years ago, India wasn't where it is now. It was down by the Seychelles. We know that because the Deccan Traps, half of it's down in the middle of the Indian Ocean, very specific geological data on what kind of rocks the volcanic deposits are like fingerprints. And before that, 90 million years ago, it was down by New Zealand. There was another hot spot. In fact, originally, India was way down, nested in the southern hemisphere, in the supercontinent that had formed in there, and it got pushed out in a similar kind of plate movement that we can see that's moving the San Andreas Fault northwards and squeezing like a banana out of a peel. And that's what happened with India. India ricocheted off of this hot spot that's in New Zealand. We can tell that because of the volcanic deposits on the eastern end of India, which match up with that group. No creationist, absolutely nobody, Andrew Snelling or anybody else, has given any physical dynamics as to how any plate movement could possibly be moving in the way that it does at the speed that it would need to do to have this taking place in a mere centuries or so after the flood. It's all absolutely hypothetical. I read their stuff. I see how vague they are. They can't work out the maps of things. If you compare an actual technical literature on the plate boundaries that are worked out in paleo, it is absolutely meticulously detailed, and nothing whatsoever at that level is occurring on the creationism side. And I'd be fascinated to see him deal with that. Plate tectonics, they had to deal with it, in part because of the fact that when the creationists of the 1960s and 70s were thinking in terms of the Earth as it is now. And they realized pretty soon that none of their models, none of the flood model, no bit of ice canopies or vapor canopies could fit with the existing geography. So they had to start lowering the mountain ranges. They had to start rearranging the landscape. They've arbitrarily been glomming onto the supercontinent material. It's happenstance, it's ad hoc, and it's geologically preposterous. And that's another reason why that the creation science community has never been able to account for anything. And yet another indication, nobody ever tries to use flood geology to find oil deposits. Not a dime's worth of that. The real geologists will only make money by following standard geology and finding where the oil actually is based upon standard cosmological systems. So that's a physical measure. Exxon and all the rest do not use flood geology for the obvious reason that it doesn't work.
There's a few things here to say. I'll start with CPT since that's the last thing that he talked about. At the end of the day, the flood does explain the fossil record. I mean, what we really see in the vast majority of the fossils from top to bottom is marine fossils. 98% of the fossils we see of marine fossils, they're mixed with land fossils. We find clams mixed with birds, mixed with horses in all different strata. So the vast majority of fossils in the record are marine. Now, animals running from the floodwaters. We find animal tracks before we find the actual animals, which is certainly tough for the evolutionists to explain. We see vegetation being destroyed, animals being destroyed, the floodwaters come in, they recede slowly, gradually, burying organisms in their habitats, slowly building and progressing its way up. Mostly in the upper layers, we see, post-flood diversification and dispersion, which is readily explainable through land bridges, floating mats, say during the Ice Age, birds distributing plants and other materials. Animals can be distributed around in very natural means during cataclysmic events. All the phenomena we see certainly fits the global flood model. The meters of seconds movement of CPT were due to underground materials pushing the pre-flood ocean crust towards the continents and dragging them down. That actually makes a testable falsifiable prediction that we discovered with NASA. I'll provide a link for that. Evolutionists like RJ, they struggle a lot explaining why these marine fossils are found on the continents, right? They have to avoid, as you can see, a global flood explanation because of their incredible bias. So they say the sea level has risen and fallen 7 times to bring fossils up to the continents. It's hard enough for sea level to rise and fall once. It has to do it 7 times. Those who study geology know that the lighter or less dense continents float on the denser mantle beneath them. This alone debunks the rising and falling 7 times of sea levels. Evolutionists can't explain the geologic record, but with our model, we can.
The material about the fossil record and the geological system, this was not developed by evolutionists. The Sedgwick was just as much of a creationist believer in God as any of the people at Answers in Genesis, but he knew his geology. And he never became an idea that the geological system was worked out by evolutionists and that it was completely independent of that it was just merely the reflection of an evolutionary assumption is just plain twaddle. And the idea that the sorting mechanisms, the claims about levels of things, this is a generic argument that's being made by creationists for the last 40 years. If you look at the specific geological deposits and the details of what is found there, you will discover that the facts are not what they are being presented. That if you look at the exact details of particular deposits and what animals and plant material are found there, you can recreate with very great fidelity the actual paleoclimate that existed at that particular time. All of this is not happening in a gigantic mush of a flood. And no flood geologist, not Andrew Snelling, not John Woodmarapp, not Ord, none of them are able to look at these material in relationship to the technical literature, or they're relying on really old stuff. Andrew Snelling would bring up material from the 19th century, 1850s material on technical points where if you discovered what the recent material was, you discovered that this mysterious deposit turned out to be a tidal formation, and that this was known to be so. So the only way that you're going to find out whether or not the secondary material that you're relying on is reliable is if you try to find out what the full facts are. And I will simply tell you that the measurement that I have at source level involving tens of thousands of technical papers, that the anti-evolution movement, including the young earth creationists, are missing 90% of the data field. And if all you do is repeat that you're getting, you're never going to be able to get past that.
Okay, just to address a few other things that he said, I think he talked about Snelling using old sources. He uses the 1859 data from, I think his name is Antonio Snyder, which evolutionists also use today, the concept of continental sprint. Evolutionists hijacked the idea and changed it to continental drift. So at the end of the day, they have a huge bias, just like he says. Apparently, we have a huge bias. We know there's an evolutionary scientist named Paul Davies. He said science takes as its starting point that life wasn't made by a god or supernatural being. It happened unaided and spontaneously as a natural process. Amazingly, genetics match predictions of the flood model. If we're going back to the flood model as he was talking about, at a genetic level, we know mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from mothers. There were 3 young women on the ark who would have repopulated the earth after the flood 4,500 years ago. And what do we know? There are 3 major types of human mitochondrial DNA in the world. Also consistent is the Babel dispersion, where one would expect sudden formation of several variants in human mitochondrial DNA due to rapid separation and isolation of various groups of people. And this is exactly what is observed. Now, since Babel, there have been, many generations accounting for the relatively larger distances, say between the dozens of these variants that we see, and the 3 major haplogroups from which they emerged, which is all consistent within a biblical model. So that's why I say if you look at genetics, that's what we can see empirically. That's what we can see certainly fits the empirical evidence.
Hey guys, this is Standing for Truth. I hope you enjoyed this short video. Please refer to the full debate where we talk about a lot more than just flood geology. This was the portions of the debate where we discuss specifically flood geology. We also talk about genetic entropy, created heterozygosity hypothesis, more genetics related evidence, the fossil record. So please refer to that debate. Now, for a little extra bonus footage, for all those who are enjoying our series titled Biblical Creation Moments, here it is. Enjoy Biblical Creation Moment number 2, the global flood. The massive amounts of evidence for a worldwide flood. The same global flood as spoken of in Genesis. Everywhere on this planet, everywhere we look, there is massive, overwhelming evidence from geology, of course, that the flood of Noah really did occur. This is undeniable. The evolutionists, the uniformitarians, they'll look to slow and gradual uniformitarian processes and local catastrophes to primarily explain what we see in geology. But what the fossil record actually supports is death and burial on a global scale. And guess what? This is exactly what the Bible describes in Genesis with the global flood of Noah. The existence of a fossil in general is absolute proof that it happened quickly. For example, environmental factors would prevent that organism from forming. But if it's covered, and any geologist can tell you this, if it's covered by sediment and protected, the fossilization process can start. And the fossil record and geology itself prove biblical creation in the Genesis flood. We see rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. We see flat, featureless boundaries. We find whole rock layer sequences deposited rapidly in quick succession. They think that it goes from marine fossils to land fossils in the order of pond scum to people evolution. But we've got marine fossils all the way through. Even with dinosaur fossils, what do we have? We've got marine fossils buried with them. This means, and it is a fact, especially because we read about this global flood in the Bible, it's a historical account. The order of the fossils is the burial order of the flood. And so if the flood began in the ocean, ripping up all those marine creatures and burying them onto the continents, they would be the first creatures to be buried. And as the floodwaters rose higher and higher, you get the burial of the land animals. And this is all exactly what we find. This means that everywhere we look, there's an abundance of evidence from geology that the flood really did occur. Nothing in the fossils supports evolution. They say that certain fossils should not be found with other fossils. And this is proof of evolutionary descent with modification. But the thing is, and the fact is, we do. And what the evolutionist does is change their stories and create rescue device after rescue device after rescue device. Evolutionary theory in and of itself is so absolutely rubbery, they can move it around and accommodate almost anything, and this isn't science. For example, dinosaurs and man did not live in the same habitat. Just like today, different creatures and different animals live in different habitats. In the pre-flood world, we see certain fossils that are usually buried together. And dinosaur fossils are usually buried with, say, gymnosperms, whereas mammal fossils are usually buried with things such as flowering plants. What does this indicate? It indicates two different ecosystems. Dinosaurs, for example, although they lived at the same time of man, did not necessarily live in the same areas or habitats. They were overcome by the flood at different times during the advancing of the waters, which explains why we don't find them buried together. Burial by ecosystems and habitats is just one of the many reasons and explanations for the flood layers and the fossils within the flood layers. We can even read in Genesis that the land of Eden, we are told, a river flows out of Eden. And we know rivers flow downhill. And so Eden was obviously at a higher elevation. We know certain animals, such as certain dinosaurs, lived in swampy lowland areas, and so various animals of various ecosystems and habitats were separated from man and other forms of life. And we can look to other explanations such as body density, intelligence, mobility, and of course habitats and ecosystems. At the end of the day, there is evidence that the earth was once underwater. We see marine fossils on mountains, in areas, landlocked areas that are actually far from the sea. Sedimentary rock layers extend over entire continents or even farther. That means the deposition of those layers had to have been catastrophic. Or as I said earlier, there would not have been much fossilization. You see fossils of animals giving birth, fish being eaten. All this suggests sudden and rapid burial. So all these observations they're in accord with the flood of Noah, covering the entire earth just a few thousand years ago. When we look at the continents today, what are they doing? They're moving only very little. But when we look to Noah's flood, the flood is described in Genesis, we aren't looking at continental drift anymore, obviously. We are looking at continental sprint. The Bible tells us that the fountains of the great deep is broken open. The earth is fractured like an eggshell. Continents are moving vertically, horizontally. And this model of catastrophic plate tectonics, continental sprint, predicts that the pre-flood ocean crust would be dragged down into the mantle. This is a process that we call subduction. Now, because that happened recently, of course, according to our model, say only a few thousand years ago, the cold ocean crust should still be cold, even though I think anybody can see that it has descended into the deep hot mantle. Now, modern seismologists have discovered that there are indeed huge cold slabs of rock down near the core itself in areas that should have warmed up. If millions of years, of course, worth of time. They look to time. Deep time is their God. And they would say that this is what would have brought those slabs down instead of Noah's flood. But the fact that we have cold slabs of rock is absolute confirmation of flood geology and not old age geology. This is a confirmed prediction. Future predictions, confirmed predictions, creationists are making them. Another amazing prediction, one of many, that has been confirmed in CPT is rapid magnetic reversals. The Earth's magnetic field draws our compass needle towards the north, but sometimes in Earth's history it draws it towards the south. Now, old age geologists believe that this has been happening for hundreds of millions of years and would have taken thousands of years to occur. It was old Earth geologists, as a matter of fact, that found confirming evidence of rapid magnetic reversals. And guess what? These are required for Noah's flood. They were taking a look at lava flows that would only take a couple of weeks in order to form. They took measurements of the skin of the lava to see the magnetic orientation. They were expecting to see almost no change as they went deeper into the hot lava, where the interior shift only slightly. Instead, what they found was the outside skin pointed north and the inside pointed south. So once again, we have confirming evidence from lava flows that the switch of magnetic field has to happen rapidly, which is exactly what flood geologists expected.